Freedom of speech is a pillar of a civilized society, and yet in France, in Europe, and beyond, the freedom of speech is under attack. On January 7, 2015, during an editorial meeting at the magazine Charlie Hebdo in Paris, two gunmen burst in. 1 minute, 49 seconds later, they had killed 11 people, including the magazine's editor and some of its leading cartoonists. The magazine had published cartoons of Muhammad. The gunmen had come to avenge the Prophet by punishing blasphemers. In September of this year, a man stabbed two people near the former offices of Charlie Hebdo, unaware the magazine had relocated. He had come planning to set fire to the building that housed the magazine. And on October 16th, in the outskirts of Paris, a man beheaded a schoolteacher, Samuel Paty, because Samuel Paty had shown pictures of those cartoons to some of his students in a class on the freedom of speech. To talk about the climate for freedom of speech in Europe, particularly when it comes to the discussion of Islam, I'm joined today by the journalist and author Flemming Rose. Mr. Rose was an editor at the Danish newspaper Jyllands-Posten, which in 2005 decided to publish several cartoons on the subject of Islam, a decision that led to a global crisis. It was these cartoons that were later republished in Charlie Hebdo. Mr. Rose is the author of a terrific book, The Tyranny of Silence, which I highly recommend. It was named one of the best books of 2014 by The Economist. And I learned a lot from reading it. Flemming, it's great to have you back on the podcast.
Thanks for having me, Elon. It's nice to be here.
So I thought we should start with just sort of a wide angle perspective on what's going on. I've described some of the situation in France in the last few weeks. Tell us your take on what's happening. You know, some people are portraying this as sort of the revival of a war with Islam or against Muslims. How do you understand what's going on?
Yeah, I think it's important from the outset to say that France, or and I think a majority of Europeans, don't think that we in Europe are at war with Islam or with Muslims. But it doesn't mean that there isn't a problem. I think we are in a hot war with violent Muslims, violent jihadists, who, in order to promote their political goals, are killing and threatening people in Europe. It's also important to stress that in the vast majority of these cases, the victims of jihadist violence are Muslims. So I think we are in a hot war with these people. At the same time, I think we are in a cold war, that is a non-violent war, but in a war of ideas with non-democratic Muslims who are in favor of abolishing democracy, abolishing the right to freedom of expression and freedom of religion. And we need to engage in this battle of ideas, and that's the way I understand what Emmanuel Macron is doing in France. But it's important to stress that this is not a war or a battle of ideas with Muslim and Islam as such. I think, in fact, it's very important that we have believing Muslims on our side in this battle.
So I thought it would be useful. I mentioned that you were on the staff at Jyllands-Posten in 2005. I think there's all kinds of misconceptions about why your newspaper decided to commission those cartoons and how they became notorious. Can you just tell us, sort of, in a summary, what were you guys trying to establish? What were you trying to do by commissioning these cartoons and publishing them? What was the trigger for doing this?
Yeah, thank you for that question. It's important to say that the cartoons did not come out of the blue. There are people out there who believe that we just published them, in order to offend, Muslim sensibilities when it comes to their belief. But that's not the case. There was quite a long prehistory, and the trigger behind me commissioning those cartoons was a debate in Denmark about a children's book about the life of the Prophet Muhammad. And the writer went public and said, I've written this book, but I cannot find an illustrator. I had problems finding an illustrator. And the illustrator, who finally accepted the job, insisted on anonymity, a form of self-censorship. he was afraid of appearing under his own name because he feared what might happen to them. And later on, he's made a specific reference to the fate of the Indian British writer Salman Rushdie, author of the Satanic Verses and the subject of death threats and a fatwa by Ayatollah Khomeini back in 1989, calling on all Muslims in the world to kill Salman Rushdie. And this Danish illustrator also made a reference to a Dutch filmmaker, Theo van Gogh, who was killed in November 2004 in daylight on the streets of Amsterdam because he had made a documentary or a short movie about violence against women, justified with quotations from the Quran. So in Denmark, there was a debate about self-censorship when it comes to debating, dealing with Islam in the public space. And some people were saying, no, there is no self-censorship. Other people were saying, no, there is self-censorship. And in order to find out and to have a debate about this, we commissioned I commissioned those cartoons back in September 2005, and they were published within 2 weeks. We didn't publish them immediately because we didn't know if this children's writer just had invented this story, and we didn't know whether this was just an isolated case or part of a broader trend. But within the course of 1 or 2 weeks, there were several other examples of self-censorship or censorship or fear when it comes to, museums, movies, books, stand-up comedians dealing with Islam. So, and that's why we decided to publish. And you have to say, 15 years after the fact that question number one, is there self-censorship when it comes to dealing with Islam in Europe? Yes, there is. And I think it's increased within the past 15 years. And question number two, if there is self-censorship, is this self-censorship just a result of people's, imagination, or is this self-censorship somehow based in reality? And we know now that this self-censorship was based in reality because people were killed, as you said in your introduction, in Paris in 2015. And I myself have been, living with security around the clock. Every time I leave my house, I'm accompanied by bodyguards, and that has been going on for quite some years now.
So, Flemming, one of the things that I remember from that time was that the cartoons were published in the fall of 2005, but the real crisis that I described in the thing where there were protests all in various countries, there were burning of embassies, Danish embassies, there was a boycott on Danish products. There was a lag time between the actual publication and then what we saw on the world stage. So what happened in between those? I mean, because the way it's told, it was a spontaneous reaction, and it if you look at that, I studied this after, and you talk about this in your book. It was not at all spontaneous in the sense that, we saw it and we people flipped out.
Yes, I think there were two main reasons for the cartoons traveling, around the world and turning into a big international conflict. One was a group of imams in Denmark that tried to rally public opinion in Denmark against Jyllands-Posten, my newspaper where I used to work, and the Danish government, in order to have public opinion condemn the publication or even toughen blasphemy laws in Denmark at the time, and they failed. They lost this public debate in Denmark, and then they decided to take their case to the Middle East. So they traveled to Cairo and Lebanon and Syria, and were met by high-level government officials and leading Islamic clerics. And this would not have happened in any ordinary situation, but was connected to the fact that there were domestic political forces in Egypt, in Lebanon, in Syria, in the Palestinian territories, later on in Pakistan, who used the cartoons in order to promote their domestic political agenda. Win elections, delegitimize Islamist groups, as in Egypt with the Muslim Brotherhood. President Mubarak at the time, for the first time in many years, had allowed the Muslim Brotherhood to run for office. And he used the cartoons, to say to the Egyptian public, I'm the real defender of Islam. You can see I'm attacking this Danish newspaper. It's not the Muslim Brotherhood. And there were similar examples in several parts of the Muslim world. So that's the reason why it turned into global conflict, not because of the cartoons, I think, in and by itself, but because there were domestic political motivations for exploiting the cartoons for domestic political ends.
I think one of the things that was really striking at the time to me is that the many people who protested, I don't think it was actually possible for them to have seen the cartoons because they weren't republished beyond, I think they were obviously in Denmark, and then Charlie Hebdo republished them, and one or two newspapers carried them. I think there was one even in Jordan, but they weren't widely shared. In fact, the opposite happened. Newspapers refused to show them, television refused to show them. So in many cases, I think it's right to think that a lot of the people rioting had not even seen these things.
Absolutely, and Norwegian friend of mine said at the time that never have so many people reacted so violently to something that so few people actually have seen. Just to tell you a funny story, a Danish filmmaker who made a documentary about the cartoon crisis, he traveled to Iran and he found the guy from the Revolutionary Guard's youth forces, Bashish, who had incited the demonstration against the Danish embassy with Molotov cocktails. And he asked them, did you see the cartoons? No. Do you want to see them? Yes. And then the filmmaker showed him this famous cartoon of the Prophet with a bomb in his turban. And this Iranian Islamist did not react to the bomb in his turban that everybody in the West had said, oh, this is so offending. He said, why does the Prophet look like a Sikh? So he didn't look like an Arab, but like a Sikh, and he found that very offensive, or more offensive than the bomb in his turban. And it tells you that there is no cartoon or image that offends in and by itself. The offense is in the eye of the beholder.
So I want to turn now to the role of Charlie Hebdo in this. So as I said, I think it was, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think initially one of the few newspapers to reprint the cartoons in solidarity was Charlie Hebdo. And then what happens if we skip forward to 2015, Charlie Hebdo that's the massacre that I described at the very beginning, and there was an enormous outpouring of support for the journalists who were killed, and we saw people, I think millions of people in the streets of France holding up banners saying "Je suis Charlie," I am Charlie, and it wasn't uniform. There were people who said the opposite. But I think there was just an incredible outpouring. And we saw heads of state from around the world locked in arms, walking down the street in solidarity with them. But one of the things that struck me not long after that is it didn't seem to last. I mean, the sentiment didn't sink in. What's your impression?
Yeah, absolutely. And already a week, the day. I think there was 4 million people who took to the streets of France in show of solidarity with Charlie Hebdo. And I already said back then that this is not the real test. This is a kind of Diana moment where you have a media event where people feel emotional solidarity with victims of violence. The real test is afterwards, in editorial offices. What decisions are you going to make as an editor, as a journalist? What are politicians going to do? What is civil society going to do? And the support for Charlie Hebdo evaporated quite quickly. I was in Paris in February 2015 and spoke to my friends and colleagues who had survived. And already a month after the killings, the tone started to shift and say, yeah, well, maybe you have the right, but you shouldn't have done this. And couldn't you see it coming? Why continue to do things like this, and so on and so forth? And today, I think Charlie Hebdo feel pretty isolated in France, and even Jyllands-Posten, where I used to work, I left the newspaper at the end of 2015. In fact, as a result of a conflict I had with the top management about our lack of support for freedom of expression when it comes to discussing these issues. Jyllands-Posten has not published any cartoons of the Prophet Muhammad since 2008 due to fear, and that's real. I understand that quite well, because there have been several plots to attack the newspaper. Kurt Westergaard, the cartoonist who made the cartoon of the Prophet with a bomb in his turban, was attacked in his house and nearly killed. So there is a real threat. But the fact of the matter is that the key to liberty and freedom is courage. And you cannot ask people, of course, to put their life on the line and sacrifice themselves. But if everybody thinks that way, then there will be no freedom of expression, because there will always be powerful forces in a society who wants to silence and will use threats, intimidation, and violence to silence voices with whom they disagree.
So I want to show now a cover of a Charlie Hebdo special edition that was published in September, and they decided to republish the cartoons on their cover, and this was timed in connection with the trial that's now underway in France for I think 14 people who are accused of involvement in the massacre. So I read this the special edition, which is available in English for people who want to read it. And it's interesting because inside they have a number of articles where they talk about sort of what's happened since 2015. One of them really struck me. It's a list of quotations from prominent people in France, journalists, philosophers, politicians. And the theme of all of their statements is freedom of speech, but you can do X, but don't offend. And one of them was, I think he's a philosopher, I forget his name, but what he said is, you shouldn't spit on the beliefs of the most marginalized group, of the people who are, meaning Muslims in particular. And so his attitude, I think, is I don't think it's unique to him. I think there's definitely this sentiment. I think we saw it here in the United States after Charlie Hebdo, after the attack in Garland. There was an attempted shooting at a cartoon event. So there's definitely this idea that we're not going to protect the principle of freedom of speech if there's some group that we feel, well, we don't want to upset them. And that seems to have really sunk in. And I mean, do you see that beyond France? Do you see it elsewhere?
Yeah, and I think it's a very flawed argument for two reasons. First, I think it's hard to define Muslims in Europe as a marginalized group that doesn't have a voice, and so on and so forth. I mean, if you think about it, we have an unwritten blasphemy law in Europe. We don't have it on the books anymore in most countries, but we have an unwritten blasphemy law because there are violent Muslims who have demonstrated that they are willing to kill if their religion or religious symbols and sensibilities are offended. And that is an exercise of power. I mean, in Europe, we have relegated the monopoly on violence to the state. In exchange, we have the freedom to exercise our freedom and rights within the law and the constitution, and the state has a responsibility to protect us when we do that, even if we say offensive and insulting things, as long as they are within the law. And blasphemy in most European countries today is within the law. But nevertheless, nobody except Charlie Hebdo publishes these kind of cartoons. I mean, that's a sign of power, I think, that you can, in fact, impose your norms on 500 million people in this way. So that's the one argument. The other argument about, do not offend. I mean, I'm offended every day when I switch on my television. I'm offended when I read newspapers, when I listen to people saying outrageous things that with which I disagree. But the difference is that I and the vast majority do not threaten violence. We do not kill people with whom we disagree, or people who say things that we dislike. So I just think this is not about causing offense. Everybody that lives in a democracy, especially in a democracy that is multicultural, multi-ethnic, and multi-religious, knows that the price for our freedom is that from time to time we will be exposed to opinions and speech that we hate, or at least dislike. So I think it's a kind of, it's not very courageous to say you shouldn't do this because I'm afraid what might happen to me or my family if you do that, or to my country. That's not very courageous. It's you hold the moral high ground if you say instead, well, you should not offend, you should not be evil and do these bad things. You can see I'm protecting this vulnerable, weak group. And this is, by the way, also what I think is racism of low expectations. There is this sense that Muslims are not able to be rational and mature and grown-ups in the same way as everybody else in our society. And I think, in fact, that's very discriminating. And if you go back to the cartoons 2005, that was in fact one of my intentions, saying to Muslims in Denmark, we do not expect more of you, we do not expect less of you, but we expect of you exactly the same as we do of every other individual and group. And in that lies a recognition of the fact that you are on an equal footing with everybody else in our society.
I've been reading some of the accounts coming out of the trial of the accomplice or the alleged accomplices from the Charlie Hebdo attack. And one statement from a journalist who survived really caught my attention. He said, and I'm going to quote it to you. He said, quote, "We're living under siege in Paris in 2020. What we are enduring," he said to the journalists in the courtroom, "you aren't interested in it." And one of the things that struck me about this is that, if you leaf through Charlie Hebdo, it's not the kind of magazine I would choose to read. It's not it doesn't particularly interest me. It's satirical, it's parodic, it's even nihilistic in places. But I admire their courage in going after the equal opportunity offenders. But if you understand, I think if you look at what Charlie Hebdo is, it's not like the New Yorker. It's not sophisticated. It's not the New York Times, Sunday Magazine. And in a certain way that I can see I think this often happens with issues of freedom of speech. It's less appealing to defend a sort of a semi-disreputable publication and say, well, there's a kind of snobbery about it. Well, who cares what happens to them? But I think that the reality is you have to defend freedom of speech regardless of who it is that's speaking, even if it's someone that I wouldn't subscribe to Charlie Hebdo, but it doesn't matter. And I think that's part of what's missing. And that's what I think is part of the tragedy that's going on there.
Absolutely. And I think, in fact, Charlie Hebdo grew out of the youth rebellion in Europe in 68. I think it was founded in 71. So, and it's very French in the sense that it sits on the shoulders of a long history and tradition of mockery of religion that is quite unusual in the United States. But that's part of French history that you had, 150 years of wars of religion in France between Catholics and Protestants and other kind of believers. And the blasphemy was in fact suspended in, I think, 1791, and then it was reintroduced. But you had then the separation of state and church in 1905, and there's always been this very tense relation between the Catholic Church and non-believers, and the Catholic Church historically has been very powerful and has put pressure on, secular principles from time to time, and non-believers have fought back by being very, harsh and right in your face mockery and so on and so forth. But that is a very French thing. And in that way, I think Charlie Hebdo is part and parcel of France, and it belongs to the left that used to stand up for freedom of expression. But I agree very much with your point that I think it was Oliver Wendell Holmes who said that we need to protect speech that we hate. And in Denmark, for instance, we have a bigot politician who is very anti-Muslim. He's burning Qurans on the streets of Copenhagen, and he was running for parliament a year or two ago. And he's very offensive. He's saying a lot of offensive things. But I think it's very important to protect his right to do these things as long as he's doing it within the framework of the law, because he's not inciting violence. He's not calling, for violence. He's not committing terrorist attacks, but he's exercising his civil liberties and rights in a very provocative way. But he has relegated, the monopoly on violence, like I and everybody else in Denmark, to the state. So the state has an obligation to protect him, even though there are a lot of critical voices talking about, how many millions we have spent on his security. But it's not about him. It's about fundamental principles of a society that wants to have freedom of expression.
I want to turn to the way the French government is responding. So even before the attack, outside of the former offices of Charlie Hebdo and what happened in Nice, which I haven't mentioned, but there was a knife attack at a basilica in the city of Nice in the south of France. And the thought is that was committed by someone who was an Islamist, sort of wanted to go after Christians. But well before this, the French President Emmanuel Macron had given a speech saying, putting out a new policy approach to what he describes as Islamist separatism. And he's been decried in many places. People are criticizing him. But leaving aside whether his policies are right or not, and leaving aside the criticisms and so on, is there a problem that I think he's trying to address? That because people are talking about parts of France or parts of other cities in Europe where there is a kind of self-segregation among Muslims. Is that something you think, is that an issue?
I think that's an issue in every Western European country. And I think it's also important to keep in mind that there has been terrorist attacks not only in France, in Germany, in the UK, in Denmark, in Sweden, in the Netherlands, in Austria recently, in Spain. So this is a common phenomenon. It is true that France is probably hit harder than most European countries, but it's not exclusively a French thing. And those who say, well, you should reinstate the blasphemy law in order to fight to accommodate this, I just want to say that Austria has quite a tough blasphemy law, and just 1 week or 2 weeks ago they had a similar terrorist attack when I think 4 people were killed. So there is a problem, and I think it's multifaceted. As far as I understand, Macron is saying, we want to fight not Islam and not Muslims, but Islamist separatism. And by that, I think he means that you have a group of people who are identifying themselves in opposition to the French Republic and its values. And Macron has, suggested several things. He wants to limit homeschooling. I personally think that I don't think the radicalization is only going on, when it comes to homeschooling. You could do that not as part of any, public schooling program as well. But he has decided to limit the opportunities of homeschooling for everybody. But the target, of course, is the Muslim population of France. And then he also wants to disinvite imams from the Middle East who are invited and paid for by countries like Turkey and Qatar, and who are running and teaching Islam in mosques across France. And they see this as a hotbed for radicalization. And finally, they want civil society associations to sign a charter, because some of this radicalization is going on in sports clubs and other civil society associations. Macron want them to sign a charter, so they commit to the values of the republic, like secularism, gender equality, and things like that. I don't have a specific problem with that. My problem with the French approach is that they are not very consistent in their defense of freedom of expression. France is in many ways a militant democracy. They have Holocaust denial laws. They also try to pass a law criminalizing the Armenian genocide. They have even laws criminalizing insulting the French flag. I think it creates a disbalance, and among Muslims a sense of being targeted, when on the one hand you have the right to blaspheme, but you do not have a right to deny the Holocaust or being anti-Semitic. I find it outrageous, and I don't think there is a moral equivalence between mocking a religious symbol and denying the killing of 6 million people in Europe during World War II. But I think that is a moral distinction. It shouldn't be a legal distinction. And I think, in fact, that this is reinforcing the sense among Muslims that they are being discriminated against when it comes to, their right to say offensive things. And I think it's especially unfortunate because if you go to the Middle East and the countries of origin of many of these immigrants, they were taught in school that the Holocaust didn't happen. And they come to Europe and they have these outrageous ideas, and we are not able to confront them, because if they say what they think, they will be, prosecuted. And they will just, I don't think they will change their mind. They will just say, oh, the Jews are also running the show here in Europe. So I would like to see a more consistent approach to freedom of expression in France than what is the case at the moment.
So Flemming, I've highly recommended your book, and you said that you added an afterword to it after the Charlie Hebdo attack. So I think the last time we talked was just a few weeks before the attack, when the book had come out that year, and so now with reflections on the attack. So tell us about the experience of being in France in 2015 after this happened.
Yeah. As I said earlier, I traveled to France in February 2015, and I met with colleagues who had survived the attack, and I feel a lot of solidarity with them. They went through horrible things. We share this fate in a way, but I was surprised about a lacking consistency in their argumentation for free speech, because I found out that all the people working at Charlie Hebdo support France's rather tough hate speech laws, meaning that they want, anti-Semitic or anti-Muslim speech criminalized when you target a group and not just a faith. And as I said earlier, I think this is a moral, valid argument, but it's not a valid legal distinction. I don't think that denying the Holocaust equals incitement to violence. It's outrageous. I want to denounce it. It makes me angry and sad, but I don't think it should be a criminal offense. First and foremost, because I don't think you change people's mind by banning, their right to say what they think. You do that by, more speech, by confronting, asking them to argue for their point of view, showing documentation, refuting their arguments, like it happens in a free and public debate.
So we were talking about Macron's speech and his proposals to elevate Republican values in France and make sure that everyone in France commits to those rather than elevating sort of religious identity. What's your perspective on those Republican values that France holds so dearly? I share those Republican values. In fact, I'm not a royalist, even though Denmark has a queen. It's a monarchy. In fact, I would like to have a republic in Denmark, but I'm in a minority here. I love France's Republican values. That is, based on the fact that you encounter one another in the public space as citizens, as equals. And the most important part of your identity is not whether you are an aristocrat, a worker, a Muslim or a non-Muslim, a Buddhist, a non-Buddhist. You are encountering one another as equal citizens. And I think that's a very beautiful and right, true idea that I support. But the problem is that quite often there is a gap between those ideas and principles and values, and then the day-to-day life of ordinary Muslims and immigrants, where it can be very difficult to find a job, to find an apartment, to get an education if you have the wrong name or the wrong background. So I think some Muslims in France are feeling frustrated when they listen to these beautiful ideals and when they experience their day-to-day life and is confronted with discrimination and things like that. Recep Tayyip Erdogan, the leader of Turkey, he reacted to Macron's speech and criticized it heavily, and he's called for a boycott of French goods. And there are actually places in Jordan and Kuwait and Qatar where there have been French products taken off the shelves. There are even protests in Iraq and Libya and Bangladesh. I think part of what he's doing is what you're describing, which is characterizing France as singling out Muslims. So I'm interested in your perspective on just sort of the relationship between Turkey and the EU, or France in particular, and sort of the tensions there.
Well, I think in general, the relationship between EU and Turkey is not very good. Turkey is still officially an applicant for membership of the European Union. But both Turkey and the EU know that this is never going to happen. And one of the leading voices for some years for blocking Turkey's accession to the EU has been France. Not only Macron, also Sarkozy and Chirac before him. So that has been going on for quite some time. I mean, there are many Turkey immigrants in Europe. I think there are more in Germany than in France, but Turkey is also supplying France with imams that are, state-educated imams in Turkey. The key here is that Turkey and the European Union in 2015 or 16, in the aftermath of the refugee crisis in the summer of 2015, signed an agreement with Turkey, saying that Turkey will block the border between the European Union and Turkey, and in exchange they will receive, I think it was 3 billion euros, to pay for accommodating these refugees in Turkey, and I mean, it means that Erdogan is sitting on, on a trigger. He could just open the floodgates and let these refugees go to Europe and create potential big problems, because the majority of European populations today, would be against such a situation, and they don't want the repetition of 2015. And of course, it creates, space for intimidation and pressure and things like that. But I don't think Erdogan has that much influence on the debate about Islam in Western Europe. I don't think people in Western Europe takes it that seriously. Apart from the Turks who are or people with Turkish background who are living among us. But in terms of the refugee issue, European politicians know that he has the power to create problems for them. But I will just add one thing that I think is important here, and that is, some people are saying that the jihadists who have committed these murders within, the past 10, 15 years or so, that it's just a small number of people. It's some crazy people on the fringes of Islam, and that's true in the sense that very few people are willing to act on their beliefs and commit killings. But I think we have to keep in mind that in 13 Muslim majority countries, you receive the death penalty for blasphemy. In most countries, people are not executed when they are convicted to death. But even though it is in the criminal code that, committing a terrorist attack, killing 1,000 people, and committing blasphemy is the same kind of crime. And I think it promotes and reinforces social and cultural norms, convincing people that if you commit blasphemy, you deserve to die. The vast majority of people will not react on this, but as we saw back in 2015 after the killings at Charlie Hebdo, in many French schools, students, pupils with a Muslim background refused to stand up in silence, and they protested. You see the same now in Germany. I've read about schools in Berlin where teachers are, shouted down when they talk about Charlie Hebdo and what happened there, and they basically think that blasphemy is a grave crime that deserves capital punishment. And I think we have to keep that in mind, that this is not just some marginal phenomena when it comes to what people think about blasphemy. Another thing is, the way people act on their beliefs.
So just to close out the conversation, I wanted to get your perspective, thinking about the situation from that week in September so many years ago when you and your colleagues were thinking about commissioning those cartoons in 2005, the Charlie Hebdo attacks 10 years later, and then today, 5 years after the attack. What do you see do you see any trends or patterns? What is the climate? It sounds like it's not improving.
No, I think the situation today when it comes to freedom of expression is worse than it was in 2005. But this has not only to do with our debate about Islam and the big difference, I think, that is that back in the beginning of the century, these jihadist groups represented a new threat to freedom of expression, and the state was kind of the back burner. I think today governments and states are back in the driver's seat when it comes to imposing new restrictions on freedom of expression. And if you look at Freedom House, Reporters Without Borders, the Economist Freedom Index, you will see that within the past 10 years, freedom of expression has been on world. But the new thing is that within the past 5-8 years, this is also happening in liberal democracies in the West. Governments imposing new restrictions on hate speech. You have in Germany a law saying that Facebook, Twitter, and other digital platforms have to remove manifestly illegal content within 24 hours or risk a fine of 50 million euros. This is quite money, and of course companies then will tend to overreact and they will delete far more content. The vast majority of what they are deleting is in fact legal. I know this is not a First Amendment issue in the United States because these are private companies, but still so much of our public conversation is taking place on these platforms. So it's not unimportant what kind of rules are being imposed upon them by governments and what kind of rules are they imposing upon themselves. And I think right now we are in a situation of moral panic on so many levels with digital platforms and other forces. And when you have a situation of moral panic, usually fundamental liberties and rights are being sacrificed. And I think that is what is happening right now.
Thank you so much for taking the time to chat with me today. I want to remind everyone about your book, The Tyranny of Silence. Highly recommend it. You can find it on Amazon. There's Kindle, there's hardcover, there's paperback. Definitely recommend picking that up. I learned a lot from that. I want to mention as well 2 books from the Ayn Rand Institute. My colleague Steve Simpson put together Defending Free Speech, and Onkar Ghate and I put together another book called Failing to Confront Islamic Totalitarianism. Both of them touch on these issues. I think they're well worth people exploring. And then let me close by encouraging everyone who's watching us on YouTube. If you enjoy this, please subscribe to our channel, like the video, and leave a comment. We'd like to see what you think. And thank you all for watching. We'll see you next time.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to subscribe, and ring the bell to never miss a video.